Hey, what's going on everyone? Clocked it here. So, in part, I wanted to wait for the Mario Kart World Direct to air before I gave my overall thoughts on the Switch 2. And of course, my thoughts on some of the current discussions around some of the deemed negatives of the Switch 2. The Mario Kart Direct happened, and personally, I think Mario Kart World looks absolutely incredible. I really do. I don't know how anyone could look at this game and have any negatives about it that could affect their overall enjoyment for the game. Based off history, this should be the only Mario Kart game we'll be getting in this console's lifetime, and I have little doubts that Nintendo will continue to support this game throughout its lifespan. Because the scale of this game is, for Nintendo, almost Breath of the Wild levels of size in terms of expanding a well-known IP into a much larger one, or a much larger playing field. And, as insane as the roster is, the name Mario Kart World for me grants the notion that other Nintendo worlds can, and I suppose should, enter. The most logical being Kirby, I feel, in terms of characters, although we are getting a new Kirby air ride, so perhaps Zelda would be the next best choice, where we can race around Hyrule Field, Death Mountain, and Lake Hylia, with these worlds being attached, to this massive Mario Kart world. So Mario Kart World, in terms of scope, is certainly not small. So we have to give Nintendo that, I suppose. And personally, I'll have a blast driving around that world, discovering things and looking for those small Nintendo details we all love. So, for the record, I received an email from Nintendo where I was given the opportunity to pre-order the Nintendo Switch 2 before it went on general pre-order. The chance to, receive an early pre-order was based off being subscribed to Switch Online for more than 3 years in a row, I think it was, how many hours you put into the games on the Switch, and finally how many promotional materials I've taken part in. Seemingly I've been a good little Nintendo acolyte over the years, and I clearly qualified. After much thought, I decided to just pre-order the base Switch 2 by itself, the console, without the cheaper digital version of Mario Kart World. Why did I do this? Let me leave that till last, and first of all, give my quick impressions on how I feel about the Switch 2 now, after mostly everything has finally been revealed. So the console, design looks, very nice. I feel I have no major issues with the price of the console, which, considering the tech it has, it's an understandable price here in the UK at £395.95, which is what I pre-ordered it for direct from Nintendo. Now the £400 value, first of all, was a bit of a eye opener, but it looks like we are getting a damn good piece of kit for this value. Most of the games we saw look incredible, which of course Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. I was about to say Donkey Kong Country Bonanza then, but the country name is gone. We just got Donkey Kong Bonanza. With those first party standouts for me, especially Donkey Kong, like I said, which I've been waiting for this type of outing again since the N64 days with Donkey Kong 64. Switch Online is getting updates with GameCube games, and from what we know so far, there has been no increase in the price of Switch Online Expansion Pass. No changes in how the family plan works, which is ideal for me, my family, and some friends. So that I see as a great positive. Although at this moment, we've lost some other benefits. We once had with the likes of earning gold coins, which could have got a discount of software, which I suppose would have been very helpful right now. Third parties are clearly on board, even if many of them are just bringing many of those games over that weren't available on Switch. So if you're a Nintendo only player, then you're in good hands. And of course, it's great to see exclusives, from Software, and of course Nintendo working with long partners to bring other exclusives like Hyrule Warriors. Plus other third-party games, we saw are still very new even if they have already been released, I don't personally see it as a negative. A game that's a year or 2 years old is still a new release in my eyes. They've introduced a new virtual card game service, which offers a chance to share digital games across a family of systems, which is very welcome. And we've seen developers state that games will also be able to be shared across multiple systems, just like DS back in the day, where one game can at the same time work on multiple systems. You could just share that one cartridge. Hopefully this works with games like Stardew Valley, as my kids would love that feature. We did end up buying like 2 versions of my Stardew Valley, but hey, we got multiple Nintendo Switches in our house. We're still getting physical games, right? They are not completely dead yet, even if other digital options are now being offered. But more on, I suppose, physical games in a moment for me, because this is going to, a big part of the conversation. The console specs look perfect for the next-gen Nintendo, I feel. And there's no doubt that most of us were floored to see games like Metro Prime 4 announced to have 4K HDR, 120 FPS modes, and once again more than that in a moment as well, maybe probably. Switch controllers are all functional on the system, which should save us a ton of money. I think we heard recently that that in the US pros has gone up, but accessories have gone up in price. But let's not forget, you can use your already existing Switch Pro controller. You don't have to buy the new one. It's good to see Nintendo stick with this, because the Switch 2 Joy-Cons and Pro controllers, as I just said, are more expensive than the previous iterations. And seeing a bit more of the Joy-Con mouse features in action, as expected, it'll be used a lot in FPS games and strategy games, as well as some fun other unique dual mouse setups as shown in Mario Party, etc. How often would it would it be used as a control setup? Will of course be based on the developer implementation and the users desire to want to use it that way. When ARMS first came out, I absolutely used the dual Joy-Con to play that game, and it worked exceptionally well. I loved it. Many Switch games are backwards compatible, just from slotting in the game. It's been confirmed that the backwards compatibility is used as some form of emulation. So there are many titles still being worked on, but we can only hope that many of those titles get updated to work in the near future, right? And speaking of backwards compatibility, some Switch games, if you're like an expansion pass member, will get upgrades to performances and resolutions as part of the service, like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. With other games, we'll get like free boosts, like Mario Odyssey, ARMS, and many others, which is all great. And for those that aren't included, some games, will get Switch 2 edition games, or if you own the Switch original game, you can seemingly upgrade for around about £10, which, if you truly love the game, then it isn't too big a price to ask, especially if some of them offer additional modes like Mario Party Jamboree, but still, there is an extra cost in many cases, when, some other platforms, or more specifically like the Xbox, will simply upgrade your older versions, for free for the most part, with the latest, better version, I believe, certainly, cases for discussion there. And then, probably finally, the game chat feature is greatly welcome, even if it's long overdue. And seeing other friends playing, the same or different games, at the same time could be great for chill chats and multiplayer fun, especially with games like Animal Crossing and Minecraft, which would be a great benefit from seeing other people's views when playing those games at the same time. And in the Mario Kart World Direct, it was cool to see that one Switch 2 camera can capture, is it 4 or 5 faces, I believe it was, at the same time on one camera. Being able to see streams of multiple people's games whilst you play your own game is a very nice feature. And we're seeing some great third-party options in terms of accessories already. So if some of those official Nintendo Switch 2 prices on accessories are a little too rich for you, then there's already other great options and looking cheaper looking options as well. So overall, I think the Switch 2 as a follow-up to original Switch, looks like a great evolution. We know that the hardware will be very capable. The games will be flowing, and hopefully in time, even more fun and unique features will appear. I have no doubts that this generation is going to see some great games. Obviously, some amazing first-party Nintendo games, but I just think the system's going to get a great library, just like the Switch one. But for now, I want to get into some deeper thoughts on other revelations that have transpired since the original information has come out. So the biggest debate online has mostly been, the price of games, or more accurately, the price of Mario Kart World. Now here in the UK, Mario Kart World on the official Nintendo website is £74.99 for the physical version, compared to Donkey Kong Bonanza, which is still a high, which is still high, but more somewhat tolerable £66.99 for its physical version. These are big jumps from a game like Breath of the Wild, which launched at £59.99, I think it was, and a slight jump above the £69.99 price of Tears of the Kingdom, even though I bought the crazy expensive limited edition version of that. And this was already declared, by Nintendo as the first of other potential games to be priced around this region, that £70 region. Now, I could go into a whole history lesson on game prices over the decades and how we've been here before, then retreated, and many arguing how these prices should have come back ages ago due to the increasing costs of development times and video games, inflation, etc., etc. But in part, I don't want to go there. I'll be getting Mario Kart World physical. I've owned every Mario Kart physical since Mario Kart started on the SNES. I was there when it came out on the SNES. This is something I personally battled with, because even for me, paying £74.99 for the standard physical game by itself, which isn't even some fancy limited edition, is a tough pill to swallow. But in regards to me buying Mario Kart physical, I'll be praying to Crom, that other retailers get that price down, a bit below £74.99, because any game price of that for any standard game, for my personal taste, is beyond the limit of most IPs I'd be willing to pay that price for on day one, or or just ever really. It's £74.99 is up there. The digital versions of these games are slightly cheaper, but for me, the most I've ever spent on a digital game is I think it's like around about £22, and that was a copy of Monster Hunter Tri HD on the Wii U, which was at a sale, back when the Wii U was out. So don't trust me to spend large sums of money on individual digital games, especially on consoles whose online shops history for staying functional isn't exactly comforting. I buy physical games, as I always have, when I can, because of many reasons. Maybe another video for the future perhaps. I remember when Sony announced that their big first party games will be £70 on the PS5, and not only did I nope out of that, but I still have not bought a PS5. And based on how that generation had progressed, I probably never will now. As for this Xbox Series, both Sony and Microsoft deserve their own videos, which I very much will try to get done at some point. So at £74.99 physical and £66.99 digital, if Mario Kart World remains the only Mario Kart on the Switch and lasts 6 to 8 years depending on the console lifespan, then across that time period and through good use, you'll be getting your money's worth for sure. But as consumers, it's always about that initial jump, right? When it comes to buying something, which is, deemed of higher value, and an initial value which some can't jump on, full stop. Now, Nintendo are clearly not charging £74.99 for every game, physical or digital, which they've made, clear off the jump with Mario Kart and Donkey Kong being different prices. Their higher prices are for specific games. But what irks me the most is the fact that they chose Mario Kart of all IPs to charge the most for. And not only that, there's a clear narrative shift in the price differences between physical and digital versions, which is both odd and not surprising given a massive software sales of Nintendo physical and digital games on the Switch, and clearly how Nintendo have seen this, and as a business or as a new Nintendo, would look to capitalize on such things. But this treads dangerous water. Nintendo once had what was called their Blue Ocean strategy. It became more well known with the Wii and the DS era. But for me, personally, I feel it started, long ago with the original Game Boy, and well, even before with a Game Watch. But let's just say the original Game Boy, and a little known game called Tetris, right? It might be easy to forget for many, but Tetris was a pack-in title for the Game Boy. A small portable system that was affordable for most, with a game that still to this day is one of the most universal and accessible games ever made. My mum played Tetris on a Game Boy. Do you want to know what she also played? Mario Kart. Nintendo's Blue Ocean strategy focused mainly on value, making games more accessible, ignoring the competition, in favor of unique Nintendo-like interactions through their devices, and probably more importantly, in regards to the name Blue strategy, broadening gaming to the masses, beyond the established, well-versed gamers. This was all achieved, by the Wii and DS through innovation, value, and intuitive software, which would attract the normies into the world of gaming. This was the Iwata era mentality. With Nintendo products and marketing, approach focused on this. In some parts it still remains. But when looking at the cost of the Switch 2 console and the higher price of software, that Blue Ocean, to engage the normies, as we call them, has certainly shrunk, I feel. Iwata was once quoted as saying, and I wrote this down, we are trying to capture the widest possible audience all around the world. Now, it's easy to look at that quote at face value and think, we need to make a Wiimote, we need to make a Wii Fit, we need to create a brain training or a Nintendogs or a Wii Sports. All these I always quote. Those are reasons and ideas are of course important. But I always had one other thing with Nintendo, which thanks to growing up on the Game Boy was always driven home to me, and in many ways essential to me as a gamer. And that was that family value. Family value doesn't always mean mum buying child a video game or a video game system. Of course, it's a big part. But what it does mean is allowing a product or products to be in the general range of affordability, which opens up the market to that Blue Ocean idea of alluring consumers of all ages and financial backgrounds into the idea of purchasing software and hardware within the gaming industry. This is why many of us had more Game Boy games than NES or SNES games. NES games, weren't crazy expensive, but they were more expensive. SNES games were £60, stuff like that. It's like my Mega Drive, for one Christmas, I had two games, Aladdin and Street Fighter. They both cost £60 each. And if I knew my mum's financial situation back then, I would never have asked for them. But like I said, many of us had those Game Boy games more than NES and SNES games. And also, when Nintendo took a different path under Satoru Iwata, when it came to the Nintendo DS and Wii, those platforms not only offered that Blue Ocean innovation to expand the market, which they very much did, but they were family affordable, general public affordable. Something I witnessed firsthand as both a consumer and also as someone who worked in video game retail during those exact eras. For me, in today's Nintendo world of IPs, if you were going to mention one Nintendo game which sang to all families as that enjoyable gaming experience which brings everyone together, I wouldn't mention Super Mario or Zelda, Metroid, Donkey Kong, Pokemon, Smash Brothers, or even Animal Crossing. I'd mention Mario Kart. Just in my opinion, for family and player, universal fun in all its aspects. Mario Kart is that series. If Switch Sports was as established and long-running IP as Mario Kart, which if we think about it, Switch, Wii Sports, Switch Sports, whatever, it's been going from the Wii. It was on the Wii U, and the Nintendo Switch. So it's on Nintendo's mind, but it hasn't hit since after the original Wii, as much as as Mario Kart continues to hit and Mario Kart continues to grow substantially. It's just look at the sales of Mario Kart 8. To look at the impact that game has on people. So we're now in an era where, yes, Nintendo has very much gone for tech when it comes to the Switch 2, and with that comes a price for the hardware. It's unavoidable, right? You can't blame them for that. In that respect, in terms of the cost. If you're gonna do this type of hardware with this level of power and tech within it, it's gonna cost. Now, it's not an earth-shattering price. Like I said, we've bought consoles at this price, before. People do. But one thing that's climbing up there, beyond what the general normies or once Wii DS or even Switch owners, felt comfortable with. It's gone beyond that we jump on old people value. I had a Switch day. I had a day one Switch in my house and 2 Switch lights. I can tell you right now, there will only be one Switch 2 in my house. Unless we get a very much cheaper Switch 2 Lite. And let's not forget, many of the Switch sales, as Nintendo has declared, came from multiple purchases in the house. Multiple Switch consoles being bought in a single house. That's how those Switch numbers climbed as well. But for Nintendo to use Mario Kart as their first super high price game, a game price which we haven't seen from them ever, off my memory, at least here in the UK, I could see that digital version built into the Switch 2 console bundle selling a lot more than the physical version of Mario Kart, at least in our launch period and and a bit beyond. And I'm sure that Mario Kart bundle will sell out. AAA gaming has now become universally expensive in the world of individual game purchases, and with that, AAA gaming, and with that, you will absolutely lose that blue ocean of growing beyond us gamers, us established gamers who still stick around. Nintendo weren't the first to do this. It's been a growing threat for ages. Jump on Steam now and look at some of the digital prices of brand new releases. Just as a quick example. As for physical games, I'll certainly be getting a lot more selective with my purchases, even from Nintendo. As for me, we are reaching that ceiling of being priced out. At least in regards to the amount of games we buy brand new. At least AAA games. Gaming should be for everyone. There's still gonna be games for everyone, of course. Like I said, luckily there are options out there, to still game on a budget. And even with services like Game Pass, this is the Nintendo way of life, and certainly I don't see grandma and grandpa buying an Xbox Series S with Game Pass in order to play Doom, The Dark Ages, or like Among Us on like a subscription for supposedly cheap. But at least the option is there for some families who will look at the proposition of a cheaper, let's say, Series S console, with a month's worth of Game Pass, as a cheaper option for the kids who, let's say, desire to play Minecraft. But this isn't an option Nintendo is given. Don't want to do the old Don Matrick, which I think someone at Nintendo recently said. I believe it was out of context, but it's the old, we still have the Switch on market, which they do, and the Switch has a staggering library, but people want to move on, right? And the Switch 2 is their new and soon to be only platform. Nintendo, have now entered the realm of high-priced gaming. A part of me wishes, hybrid Nintendo away into the abyss, and for them to return with two platforms. One as a budget platform with its own library of games, Nintendo DS and 3DS style, and one with a home console where, if you want to charge a premium, then there will be a market for that. Everyone should be able to afford to play Mario Kart in my eyes. It's that one series that everyone loves, everyone understands, and everyone can grapple with. Nintendo, I suppose, just need to be careful here. As they don't want to price themselves out of a market. At one point they were the affordable company. But they are starting to straddle that line now, and I worry about where they'll go from here. It's gonna get difficult, right? Think when the next Zelda comes out. If Tears of the Kingdom was £70, think when the next Zelda comes out on this bigger, more powerful platform. Will the next Zelda be $74.99, or will it be £79.99? In the US, will it be $89.99? Maybe even higher. It's just the way the world has gone. The way tech has grown so fast, and and I didn't want to mention inflation, but it is what it is, and how wages haven't caught up. Gaming as we once knew it now is, I think, going to skyrocket into a realm of, it could shrink, sales wise, for these big budget games, mostly. But thankfully, like I said, we still got these great indies and some AA developers, around, and Nintendo will still do their AA games, just that their peak games will most likely come at a chunky price. But all right, that was a long video. But if you stuck around for the full, listen, I appreciate it. I know a little late on this, but like I said, I wanted to wait for the Mario Kart Direct to finish in case something else came out. I haven't touched upon everything here, of course, but at least you have some thoughts to work with within the comment section. So, please, as always, let me know your thoughts, and I'll reply to every one of you. Take care, all, and peace.